as the academic director of the Holberg Prize, it is a pleasure for me to open this year's Nils Klim seminar in honor of the 2020 Nils Klim laureate, Frederik Poulsen. The prize is awarded annually to an outstanding scholar under the age of 35 from a Nordic country. In the recommendation for awarding the prize to Frederik Poulsen, the Nils Klim Committee writes, quote, "Poulsen is an exceptionally accomplished scholar in biblical studies. His work is characterized by an innovative combination of historical, critical, and literary methodologies that have enabled him to cast new light on these ancient texts. His second doctoral thesis, entitled The Black Hole in Isaiah, a study of exile as a literary theme, challenges the notion that Zion, Jerusalem, is the main issue in Isaiah. Instead, Poulsen argues that exile serves as its dark counterpoint by focusing on exile and diaspora, which involve profound experiences of alienation and suffering. Poulsen creates a link between ancient history and current issues of identity and belonging. Due to the depth and excellence of his work, Poulsen has been awarded a number of prestigious grants and fellowships. His classical scholarly expertise and his creative approaches to Old Testament studies have already earned him a solid position in biblical studies. We have just been informed that Frederik Poulsen will also receive the Silver Medal for Outstanding Research from the Danish Royal Academy during a ceremony in Copenhagen tonight. We congratulate him on this prize as well. Because of the corona pandemic, we were forced to cancel our celebration of Frederik Poulsen last June. But fortunately, we have managed to organize the Nils Klim seminar today, and for the first time as a virtual event. It is our hope, despite the absence of a live audience, that we will be able to reach a wide audience in Norway, in Denmark, and in the world at large by live streaming the event. The seminar will also be made available to the audience through our website at holbergprize.org after the event. Please let me introduce the moderator of the seminar, Einar Thomassen, who is Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Bergen. He will introduce the laureate as well as the two other members of the panel, and he will also lead the discussion between the participants of today's seminar, as well as the Q&A session at the end. We encourage viewers to take part in the discussion at the end by sending questions to our website at holbergprize.org or via Twitter with hashtag NilsKlim2020. Einar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Welcome to the 2020 Nils Klim seminar. The Nils Klim seminar has become a regular part of the Holberg Prize events, and we are happy to finally this year to be able to present this seminar in the digital format that you are witnessing at the moment. The recipient of this year's prize is, as you have already heard, Frederik Poulsen, who is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Copenhagen. And the prize has been awarded to him for his excellent research on the Hebrew Bible. It is the first time, I might add, that the prize has been awarded to a scholar of religion. Frederik Poulsen has published no less than 3 monographs since 2014. The last of the 3 was called The Black Hole in Isaiah and was published in 2018. I think I should use a couple of minutes now to just explain what is meant by the black hole in this remarkable book. The black hole refers to a non-existent part of the book of Isaiah. that is the gap between chapter 39 and chapter 40 in this prophetic book of the Bible. If you read the book of Isaiah, you will see that the first 39 chapters all contain more or less prophecies of doom, whereas suddenly in chapter 40, the mood has changed completely. Now we read about rejoicing and praising of the Lord because he has then seen to his people again and given testimony of his support of the people. So something has evidently happened between chapter 39 and 40, and that is the black hole, which then in Frederik Poulsen's reading constitutes the underlying structuring element of the book. So the absence of the central theme, which is the exile itself, has become the key to reading this particular book. Now, in the course of his study, Frederik Poulsen has been able to explore essential themes of this book, which can also be explored in other parts of the Hebrew Bible, such as the dialectics of exile and home, migration, displacement, loss, even captivity and enslavement, but also how exile opens up new possibilities for change, for reorientation, and for recalibration of self and otherness. So it is the dialectics between the loss and the new opportunities represented by exile which forms the central object of research in Poulsen's study. I think that this particular piece of research is a very good example of how our understanding of history is continually stimulated and shaped by contemporary concerns and insights. And it's also an example, if you look at it from the other point of view, of how our understanding of the present may be enriched by the knowledge of the past, by the realization that problems that seem to us to be urgent today are not usually new problems, but have been met by people living before us and have been handled in various ways which can serve as examples for us today. Thirdly, I would also add that the themes of migration, exile, and reorientation are universal themes. They are themes that are not specific to the particular type of texts that we are discussing here today, but can be found in other religious traditions as well. For instance, the city of Rome was built on the foundational myth of a migration from, Aeneas is traveling from Troy to Italy. The religion of Islam also has a foundational story in the migration of Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. Forced exile, but also a source of new opportunities. So the themes that we are discussing with reference to the Hebrew Bible are also able to throw light on very many other materials from the world of religion and history in general. Now, to the presentation of today's participants, we have three presenters who will give their papers first, and then there will be a discussion by the panelists after that, and finally we open up the floor for a general discussion in the form of questions that you may send in, as you have heard. The first presenter will be the laureate himself, Frederik Poulsen, who is going to speak about the concept of fleeing from God, exemplified by the biblical figures of Cain and Jonah. The second speaker, who is present with me in the room here today, is Kristin Joachimsen, who is Professor of Old Testament at the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society. She is going to approach the theme of of exile, identity formation from the point of view of the book of Ruth in the Hebrew Bible, and the main character of that book, Ruth herself. Finally, the third presenter is Dr. Casey Strine, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield in ancient Near Eastern history and literature. Dr. Strine has also published on the theme of exile in his previous work, and will speak to us today about King David, who on King David, before he was king, he had to flee from his enemies. So the experience of exile is also part of maybe the royal ideology of ancient Israel. But without more ado, I'm now going to give over the floor, or the screen if you like, to the first presenter, who is the recipient of the Nils Klim Prize himself, Frederik, who is going to speak about the theme Fleeing from God. Please, Frederik, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Einar Thomassen. Honored colleagues and students, whether you are near or far away, let me first express my sincere gratitude to the Holberg Committee for selecting me as this year's recipient of the Nils Klim Prize. I am deeply honored. Let me also express my gratitude for organizing the Nils Klim seminar today. I was asked to choose the topic for the seminar, Migration in the Bible. And I'm happy that my colleagues, Dr. Casey Strine and Dr. Kristin Joachimsen, have agreed to participate, and I look forward to listening to your papers and discussing this important issue with you. My hope is that we will be able to show the richness of perspectives in the Bible, perspectives that might serve as a resource for thinking about migration and hospitality, past and present. In my own paper, I will look at literary motives of migration and flight in the stories about Cain and Jonah. But let me first turn to a brief overview of migration in Hebrew Bible scholarship. In past scholarship, issues about migration have most prominently been studied in connection to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. In the first decades of this century, the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem and destroyed its temple. While most of the inhabitants remained, or while some of the inhabitants remained by the ruins of the city, or in the surrounding region of Judah, others were forced away or fled to foreign territories, including Egypt and Mesopotamia. Until the 1980s, scholars generally approached the Babylonian exile and migration as a historical phenomenon connected to these events. Yet, since the 1980s, biblical scholars have also studied migration, exile, forced migration, diaspora as a broader social and cultural phenomenon. This new perspective includes the application of insights and methodologies from other scientific disciplines. Furthermore, important discussions about terminology have drawn attention to the various words we use to label the realities we encounter in the ancient texts. 4 general approaches to the critical study of exile and migration in biblical literature have emerged. First, a historical archaeological approach which addresses questions about what we know historically about migration and movement of people in the period of the biblical texts. Second, a sociological approach which seeks to place the biblical texts in close dialogue with sociological, anthropological, and psychological analysis, for instance, by comparing the experiences of migration reflected in the Bible to contemporary experiences, patterns, and social realities. Third, a literary approach which focuses on the textual representation of migration, that is, migration and exile as a literary motif and the use of words, images, and metaphors. 4. A reception historical approach which studies the interpretation of migration and exile in later Jewish and Christian writings. My own work mostly focuses on literary issues. I have co-edited a volume of essays on the language and metaphors that the Old Testament prophets use to express the experience of exile. My doctoral dissertation from 2019 studies exile as a literary and theological motif, indeed as a black hole, in the book of Isaiah, and my current research project, supported by the Carlsberg Foundation, studies issues about assimilation and religious identity in stories about Jews living in a non-Jewish context. I am in particular interested in the ways that characters in the stories seem to embody or illustrate experiences of migration, removal, separation, and social marginalization. In my book about exile in Isaiah, I have a whole chapter on such typological figures, and my paper today draws from this work. In the Bible, we encounter several of such characters. Adam and Eve are driven out of Eden. Abraham and his family travel as strangers. Moses is a stranger in every land or people he encounters, and he only finds home in the wilderness outside the civilization of man. And even David, the great king of Israel, as Casey Strine will address later, flees from enemies and moves to the surrounding region. Characters such as Joseph, Ruth, Daniel, and Esther reflect on living as a stranger among foreign nations. Perhaps these figures serve as a kind of role models for how to live and behave in a foreign land. I'm sure Kristin Joachimsen will take up this question in her paper. Finally, in the stories about Cain and Jonah, migration in terms of flight constitute a central theme. Let me first turn to Cain. Most people in our part of the world know the story of Cain, who kills his younger brother Abel, the first murder in the history of humanity, according to the Bible. Nevertheless, we tend to forget the second half of the story, which narrates God's punishment of Cain for his crime. A passage which contains several images of banishment, wandering, and eternal flight. The Lord said, "And now you are cursed from the ground. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer, no wenod, on earth." The punishment consists of two elements. First, Cain is cursed from the ground. His former work as a farmer is made impossible because the ground will no longer yield its wealth. Indeed, Cain is alienated from the ground and therefore becomes a homeless wanderer. Second, Cain is condemned to live as a fugitive and a wanderer, no on earth. One could also construe the Hebrew phrase as a hendiadith, that is, a wandering vagrant or a wandering fugitive. The first verb no means to shake or to wander. It is the uncontrolled movement of a drunk man and of those who are dizzy due to hunger and thirst. The second verb, nod, means to flee or to move hither and thither. It designates the movement of birds and the flight of people. The specific phrase no nod occurs only here. The two words, however, are also coupled in the description of an earthquake. The earth staggers like a drunkard, it sways like a hut. In light of this, the pairing of these words here indeed emphasizes the restless and aimless life of Cain as a fugitive and outlaw. The extreme and dangerous life that these terms suggest makes it clear that Cain is not simply condemned to a nomad's life. As a lonesome wanderer, Cain will face opposition and potential death everywhere he goes. Verse 14 sums up the fate of Cain in his own words. Cain said, "Today you have driven me, kirashta, away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me." God has driven him away from the ground. The verb garash, to drive away, echoes its use in the banishment of Adam and Eve from paradise in the preceding chapter. Just as Cain's father, Adam, was driven out of the Garden of Eden to harsh work as a farmer, Cain is driven out to a wandering life on earth. Perhaps the echo suggests that Cain is now being distanced even further away from God than his parents were. He can find rest nowhere. Cain understands his fate as a constant yet ultimately impossible flight from God's anger. Until his death, he will be exposed to divine judgment, and he will thus hide himself from God's presence. Cain reviews his destiny as a fugitive, both from man and from God, and laments his lack of protection. As a response, God puts a sign on Cain, the famous mark of Cain. It is a mark of survival, but it has an ambiguous meaning. On the one hand, it shows that Cain is not separated from the Lord's protection. On the other, the mark serves as a constant reminder of Cain's banishment, his isolation from all people. Verse 16 concludes the trial scene with Cain's departure from the face of God. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, Melivne Adonai, and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Eventually, he lives or settles in the land of Nod, Be'eretz Nod. The place itself plays on his destiny as a wanderer. It is a symbolic reference to his isolation and restless wandering. he is going to the land of wandering. And this very place will remind him of his destiny as an eternal fugitive. I believe F.A.P. Cormon's illustration from 1880 grasps the brutality and despair of Cain's destiny. He will be constantly on the move. His residence will never be permanent, but one of constant roaming from place to place. Another well-known and popular story from the Bible is the one about the prophet Jonah. God calls him to proclaim judgment against the great city of Nineveh, but Jonah flees from the commission. He ends up in the belly of a great fish. Scholars have proposed to read the tale as an image, an allegory of the people of Israel in exile. Jonah stands for Israel, while the fish stands for Babylon. Whether or not we accept this reading, and many don't, there are several literary elements in the story, particularly in the hymn in the belly of the fish, which render images of distance and distancing. First, Jonah is on the flight, but Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He moves, or rather, he is being torn between Nineveh and Tarshish. Nineveh is the great city to the east, and Tarshish is far to the west, possibly near to modern Spain, at the border of the unknown world. Jonah's initial movement is horizontal. That is, he moves geographically towards Tarsus, the opposite direction of Nineveh. It is interesting that Jonah sets out to flee from the presence or face of the Lord, milivnei Adonai. The same phrase is used in the story about Cain when he departs from God's presence. These instances are the only ones in the Old Testament that occur in the context of moving away from the Lord, which brings the fates of Cain and Jonah even closer to each other. Nevertheless, Jonah does not only move across the sea in a horizontal direction, but also vertically down into it. As God is traditionally located in the high, Jonah attempts to escape him by going down into the deep. The key word here is yada, to go down. Jonah goes down to Joppa, he goes down in the ship, and he goes further down into the hold of the ship. This gradual descent is both spatial and spiritual. He is thrown overboard and ends up in the deep of the sea, where he goes down or sinks to the roots of the mountains. Jonah's psalm in the belly of the fish develops the themes of the preceding narrative. It contains two main motives: spatial movement and the absence of Yahweh, or the Lord. Verses 4 and 5 portray the horizontal movement of distancing. You cast me into the deep. Then I said, I am driven away, nikrashti, from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The physical separation from the Lord and his temple is itself God's doing, and due to his absence and failing support, Jonah suffers from the terror of death. Both motives are reversed in verses 7b, when suddenly the Lord is present and brings Jonah up from the pit. The opening word, "you cast me," "watashlikeni," suggests a motive of rejection or expulsion. Jonah is cast into the sea, which serves as a metaphor for the distance to his home. The sea is deep and far away from land. Verse 5 in particular expresses the pain of being away from home. First, Jonah says, "I am driven away from your sight." The use of garash, to drive out, is striking. The same term designates the expulsion of Adam and Eve and of their son Cain. Like them, Jonah has been banished from the Lord's presence. Moreover, Jonah, full of despair, cries, "How shall I look again upon your holy temple?" The prophet, who has attempted to flee from the Lord's presence, now desperately laments his inability to worship him in the temple of Jerusalem. As Philip Peter Jensen notes, Jonah may have started by fleeing on his own account, but now he recognizes he has no control of his destiny and is driven by divine agents of judgment that he cannot command. Verses 6 and 7a portray the vertical movement of sinking. The waters closed in over me. I went down, Yarati, to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Jonah is brought to the bottom of the sea. He is at the root of the mountains. The motive of going down, Yarat, marks the climax of his descent. He cannot get any farther away from the God who dwells in the high. He has entered into the land whose bars have closed upon him forever. It is a terrifying image of an inescapable prison. Like Cain, Jonah is a rootless wanderer, an eternal fugitive. He is abandoned by God, but unable to flee from his presence. Distance, separation, rejection, and near-death experiences are key themes in his psalm, "In the belly of the fish." Some concluding reflections. As I briefly mentioned, the characters of Cain and Jonah can easily be interpreted as illustrations of collective experiences. In the rich and diverse reception of the Bible, Cain was very early understood as an archetype for all wicked people. Jonah, likewise, has been read as an image of exiled Israel, punished for its rejection of the word of God. Moreover, the stories contain powerful images that may be helpful to grasp and cope with situations in our own lives. Take the restless and aimless wandering of Cain, a severe kind of rootlessness where you keep searching for a place to rest. Or Jonah and his spiritual descent down into darkness and despair. Cain and Jonah cannot flee from their destinies. However, a crucial point in both stories is that God will protect and guide even those who attempt to flee from him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederik. I then turn over the screen to Kristin Joachimsen, who is with me in the studio here today. Kristin, you're going to speak about the figure of Ruth.
Hospitality, risk and migration touched on pressing and contested social, cultural and political issues of our time. This is part of a public debate where the diversity of opinions is great and where participants put different labels on each other's attitudes. In the public discourse in Norway, the debate is characterized by labels like hostility of immigration and tyranny of goodness, where immigration is regarded as a threat or met with generosity. In this paper, I will explore the complexity of issues like hospitality and risk in relation to migration. I will explore the book of Ruth, a story about a Bethlehemite family escaping famine in their hometown and seeking refuge in Moab, and a Moabite woman entering Bethlehem in search of sustenance. The current migration situation has led to a renewed focus on migration within biblical studies. Research on this ancient material draws on other academic disciplines, especially within cultural studies and social sciences. This interaction shows how the biblical texts might illuminate the current situation and how today's context provokes new perspectives in ancient texts. Hospitality, risk and migration are topics that appeal to an interdisciplinary conversation precisely through encounters between foreign and well-known academic traditions. The term hospitality is used to offer migrants good treatment and at the same time give the host a positive self-understanding. The discourse on hospitality is benign, generous and inclusive, but as the contested public debate shows, the risk is lurking. In cultural studies and social sciences, the metaphor of hospitality is also used to describe countries' inhospitable and hostile treatment of immigrants, refugees and asylum seekers, connected with a policy aimed at tightening borders and limiting immigration. A fruitful contribution to this debate is the philosopher Jacques Derrida's distinction between unconditional and conditional hospitality. Unconditional hospitality poses a risk when a host opens the door to a stranger, representing a potential danger. Conditional hospitality conveys limitations associated with giving, taking, and having power. This is further connected with a paradox. The host's generosity, openness, and risk-taking are at the same time linked to the power to be able to choose who one wants to invite to one's home or offer asylum, and which excludes those who are not chosen. And also to set certain requirements and expectations for the one who is invited. The cultural analyst Mirel Rosello adds post-colonial perspectives to Derrida's thinking. In her analysis, it is essential that the migrant is not reduced to a one-dimensional victim, but is seen as a complex and acting human being. This is a reaction to the tendency to make the migrant the other, a voiceless, helpless, dependent homogeneous, a powerless victim of political circumstances. In this connection, Rosello problematizes the binary host-guest metaphor, which has dominated the definition of immigration in many countries recently. As with Derrida, she also points out that hospitality can be risky for everybody involved. For instance, What happens if the host or guest does not behave as expected? If the host gives the guest bad treatment, or the guest misbehaves or does not show gratitude? This is also about how to deal with the difference that the stranger embodies. The Book of Ruth is a finely crafted story with a dense and poetic character. Many academics have applied this story to think with, in connection with migration. The book has been taken to be a harmonious, charming, and also ambivalent story about people on the move. Literary critic Cynthia Ossix interprets the Moabite Ruth, who settles down in Bethlehem as an idle, fully assimilated immigrant, in which Ruth's conversation to the god of Naomi, Bethlehem, and Israel from the deities of Moab testifies to the worthiness of Yahweh. Philosopher and literary critic Julia Kristeva, on the other hand, stresses the otherness which Ruth personifies, which makes the Israelites more open to difference. The otherness which Kristeva appreciates when it comes to Ruth is one fitting into a cosmopolitan identity. However, Kristeva's cosmopolitanism is a cosmopolitan identity without foreignness, or rather a distinctively French cosmopolitanism. Both this interpretation might illustrate Ruth's popularity and not her sister-in-law Orpha's. Ruth is remembered for her fidelity to Naomi and Israel's people and deity, which strengthens the self-identity of the community of Israel. The political theorist Bonnie Honich criticizes such interpretations of Ruth because they evaluate an idle immigrant in terms of what she will do for us as a nation. For instance, the immigrant's choice of us make us feel good about who we are. Honich instead highlights both Ruth's gains and her losses. While the fields of Bethlehem have good connotations for many readers, and memories of Moab as an enemy of Israel is frequently evoked as part of a broader context, a closer examination will show that the picture is more complicated in this story. Through encounters of families and communities seeking help and offering care, chesed, hen, menoach, and risk are closely related. Due to a famine at home, the Bethlehemite family of Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons are sojourning and residing in the fields of Moab. In Moab, they receive shelter as well as experiences death and barrenness. Just after their arrival, Elimelech dies, and his two sons marry local women. Eventually, after 10 years, these men also die in Moab, and 3 childless widows remain. The Bethlehemite Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, the Moabites Ruth and Orpah. Naomi hears rumors that by Yahweh's intervention, the conditions have improved in Bethlehem, and she prepares for returning home. On the way, she urges her daughters-in-law to return to Moab, praying to Yahweh that the deity shows them chesed, kindness, as a reward for the chesed the 2 Moabites had shown her and her sons, the late Bethlehemite husbands. Chesed is associated with excessive kindness, generosity, solidarity, loyalty, justice, obligations, merit, duty, etc. The term might also include an expectation of reciprocation, which might motivate one's hospitality. In this episode, chesed is not a specific quality of the Bethlehemites. Chesed transgresses ethnic, religious, and cultural boundaries, as the Moabites practice it towards the Bethlehemites, and possibly Yahweh towards Ruth and Orpha in Moab. Additionally, family ties are involved due to marriages between Bethlehemites and Moabites. Naomi cannot help Ruth and Orpah, but she can put her trust in Yahweh for their menorah, rest, survival and sustenance back home in Moab. While chesed is not a specific quality of the Bethlehemites, as we shall see soon, in certain instances at the fields of Bethlehem, it might perhaps even be rather the opposite. When Naomi urges her daughters-in-law to return to Moab, Orpah consents and returns weeping to her people and her deity, while Ruth insists on clinging to her mother-in-law, and the two go together to Bethlehem. After they arrive in Bethlehem, Ruth starts gleaning in the field and seeks hen favor in order to ensure survival for Naomi and herself. Gleaning is a way the vulnerable might get sustenance, but also involves a risk. In the fields of Bethlehem, Ruth encounters both care, protection, as well as danger. It turns out that the field that Ruth goes to belongs to Boaz, a wealthy man who is part of Elimelech's extended family. Boaz asks the overseer of the harvesters about the young woman in the field, and the overseer identifies her as the Moabite who returned with Naomi from Moab. Boaz invites Ruth to glean and instructs her to stick with the young women in his field and not in another field. He also instructs his male servants not to touch Ruth. Later on, Boaz reiterates the instructions to his male workers in a variation. They shall ease Ruth's gleaning and neither reproach nor rebuke her. This repeated instruction extends even more in terms of Ruth's opportunities and shows how she is protected from risk. Later, in a conversation with Naomi, Ruth quotes what Boaz had said to her, in which Ruth tells her mother-in-law that Ruth is supposed to stay with his young men. Ruth's quotation here differs from what Boaz said. While he instructed her to stick with his female servants, according to Ruth, it is his male servant she is supposed to stay with. Also, Naomi perceives the workers at the field as a potential threat to Ruth, insisting that her daughter-in-law remains with Boaz's female servant so that those in another field not strike her. As the risk Ruth might be facing while gleaning in the fields of Bethlehem is presented in different ways by Boaz, Ruth and Naomi, also scholars offer various interpretations of the dangers Ruth might encounter here. She is stricken, bothered, embarrassed, harassed, humiliated, assaulted, attacked, experiencing lethal or sexual violence. Furthermore, various views prevail about whether these risks relate to Ruth being a woman, a stranger, or a foreign woman. For instance, the character of the violence taking place in the story has been interpreted in light of Ruth's vulnerability due to her migrant status. When Naomi and Ruth arrive at Bethlehem, the townswomen greet Naomi and express surprise by asking, "Can this be Naomi?" A dialogue between the Bethlehemite women and Naomi follows, in which none mention Ruth, and she does not speak herself either. Later on, during the nocturnal encounter of Ruth and Boaz in the field, Boaz stresses Ruth's good reputation in Bethlehem, stating that the whole gate of my people knows what a fine woman you are. Towards the end of the story, the nearest redeemer and Boaz negotiate the field left after Elimelech. Boaz buys the field and gets Ruth as part of the purchase. 10 town elders and the people are witnesses when Ruth's future is decided. The townspeople and the elders bless Boaz and Ruth's marriage, and she is embedded into Israel's past, as they compare her to Rachel, Leah, and Tamar. After the divine intervention, Boaz and Ruth have a son, and the Bethlehemite women pay tribute to Naomi for the son who is born. Thus, while Ruth is integrated into the Bethlehem community with her marriage and her son, the town's women identify the baby boy as Naomi's redeemer. The women of the neighborhood give him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. The end of the book of Ruth relates to the beginning of the story, the broken male genealogical line in chapter 1. Ruth's arrival in Bethlehem widens Israelite identity by making possible the continuation of the Genesis family line, leading to David the king. And by Yahweh's intervention of Ruth's conception, the genealogy of Perez left off in Genesis continues. So what does the book of Ruth tell about hospitality, risk and migration in the fields of Bethlehem and Moab? Both the issues of hospitality and risk are composite, relational and situational. In this story, we get facts in the field related to situations of relocations, migration and return. The story is in several ways characterized by encounters with someone who is not invited. Once the meetings have taken place, the Bethlehemites are received in Moab's field, and the townswomen, the harvesters and the people at the gate of Bethlehem meet Ruth the Moabite when she arrives at their fields and their town. The boundaries are complex and porous, in which both reciprocity, inclusion and alienation are at stake. While matters of survival and sustenance are engaged, transgressing borders are key. Chesed transgresses ethnic, religious and cultural boundaries as the Moabites practice it towards the Bethlehemites in need and vice versa. The term includes an expectation of reciprocation which might motivate one's hospitality. While it is common to explain Moab and Moabites as an enemy of Israel in the Hebrew Bible, various memories prevail in this material. In the book of Ruth, Chesed seems to be the most prominent characteristic of a Moabite's behavior towards the Bethlehemites. The presentation of the Bethlehemites' behavior towards the Moabites, however, is more composite, implying both care and danger. As Chesed is not something typical Bethlehemite in this story, in certain instances among the harvesters in the field, it might perhaps even be rather the opposite. The fields of Bethlehem turns out to be an ambiguous site, a site of care, protection and risk. While Boaz seeks to assure Ruth's sustenance and safety, both by allowing her to glean as well as be protected by sticking to the company of his female workers, both his male workers as well as the workers at the neighbor fields might pose a danger to her. Finally, who belongs to the herd? Regarding the relationship between chesed and migration, one might ask how long an immigrant is regarded as a stranger, a refugee or a guest. As such, Ruth is challenging the question of hospitality to the stranger. When, if, is she taken to be a full member of a family, village, people, a neighbor, one of us? While Ruth has chosen Naomi and Israel's people and God, doing good for the Bethlehemites, what self-identity of Israel does the story strengthen? Ruth is taken care of while in need, such as widows and sojourners, and is praised for choosing Naomi and Bethlehem over her family in Moab. She becomes a member of the Bethlehemite community, gradually affirmed by others, by Boaz, the whole community, and by Yahweh. Through Ruth, Israel gets a Davidic descendant. At the same time, she remains a Moabite throughout the story and becomes silent and is not mentioned by anyone. Ruth gets something: the mother-in-law Naomi, her God and her people, the village of Bethlehem, protection from Boaz as well as the son Oded, who is admittedly taken over by Naomi. And she loses something else: her sister-in-law Orpah, her mother's and father's house, the people and the gods of Moab. Ruth is more than a stranger, migrant and guest, but still she is not one of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. And then we come to the third presentation of the panel today, and I turn the floor over to Dr. Casey Strine, who will speak to us about the figure of David and and the exile that he had to go through early in his career. Casey, please.
Thank you, Professor Thomassen. And I want to begin by saying my congratulations as well to Frederik Poulsen for the award of the Nils Klim Prize. I'm very sorry that we can't all be there together to celebrate this, but I'm very thankful that I'm able to participate in this online seminar, and I'm very much enjoying the papers, and I look forward to the discussion. Before I start my paper, it's important for me to say that you will see on my slides a number of images that were drawn by people that I worked with here in Sheffield who were seeking asylum or living as refugees. That came as part of our discussions of different texts in the Bible about migration, and especially about the experience of being an asylum seeker or a refugee. I want to thank them for their permission in using these images, and I hope that they will enrich the presentation that I'll be giving while you see them. Consider this unusual account of David ben Jesse of Bethlehem. The youngest son in a family of 8 boys, David ben Jesse lives as a shepherd in rural Judah. His life changes abruptly when the prophet Samuel arrives in Bethlehem and anoints him as the successor to King Saul ben Kish from Benjamin. Subsequently, David proves himself a fearless soldier in his fight with the Philistine hero Goliath, and through his daring incursion to kill 200 Philistines as a bride price for Saul's daughter Michal. David joins the royal family as Saul's son-in-law and serves as a sort of mindfulness guru to the emotionally unstable king. David develops a deep bond with Jonathan ben Saul, heir to the throne. All is not well. Saul grows paranoid about David's aspirations, so that he encourages his confidants to kill David. Jonathan, however, informs David of the threat, which enables David to escape harm. Nonetheless, David has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. That is the definition of a refugee according to the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, and this compels him to flee. David first seeks safety within Judah. Helped by his well-connected associates, Michal his wife, Jonathan his brother-in-law, Samuel his political patron, and Ahimelech, a priest at the sanctuary of Nob, David survives an internally displaced involuntary migration for some time. Under threat still, he departs Judah eventually in search of refuge outside Saul's jurisdiction. David selects Gath as a destination. This city in the Philistine heartland, located on the major travel route along the Mediterranean coast, represents both a logical and illogical destination. Urban, adjacent to a major transportation network, multicultural, Gath could allow a migrant to settle and to integrate successfully without attracting much attention. The transportation connections also offer the chance for further migration to destinations south or north. Nevertheless, Gath is also the city of Goliath, David's most famous military conquest. David cannot be anonymous here, and he is almost immediately recognized so that his presence is reported to King Achish. King Achish of Gath in times judges that granting David asylum is a reasonable risk to take. Achish settles David in Ziklag, making him a legal refugee. And to a large extent, Achish reaps rewards for doing so. David faithfully supports Achish and even agrees to fight with the Philistines against Saul. Lingering suspicion among the Philistine military leaders persists, and they will not permit David to join them. The ensuing battle, which David does not join, results in Saul's death. David returns to Judah now. The threat of his life from Saul ended. The asylum seeker and refugee voluntarily repatriates, finding warm acceptance from his fellow Judahites, who anoint him king over them. Nothing now stands between David and the throne but to subdue the Benjamites. From Hebron, David successfully attacks the Benjamites, gains their allegiance, and then conquers Jebus in order to make it into his new capital, Jerusalem. A migrant who has lived in many cultures, David establishes a new city without ancestral connotations to generate an entirely new society where he can dwell and unite the surrounding communities that have been enemies around a common narrative of divine election and presence. Despite early success in concord, trouble still lurks. David fashions a crisis among his royal court and military leaders when he constructs a ruse to obtain Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. Notably, David first encounters Bathsheba when he should be away from Jerusalem campaigning with his army. David's failure to journey from Jerusalem when he should be with the traveling party, his refusal to migrate voluntarily, even for a limited period of time, lies at the heart of all his subsequent troubles. David's rape and marriage by capture of Bathsheba creates a fractious atmosphere among his family. The dysfunction motivates Absalom, David's third-born son, to lead a successful palace coup against his father. The likely success of Absalom's rebellion compels David to leave Jerusalem with his royal court. For the second time in his life, David has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group that compels him to flee his country. David escapes eastward, crossing the Jordan River and the Jabbok River at Mahanaim. Apparently possessing supplies to sustain this migrant caravan for some time, David self-settles in this rural, perhaps remote area of the Gilead. Absalom pursues David here and presses his father into a battle at Mahanaim. David wins. The victory enables David to make a second return migration, now to his home in Jerusalem. David will never leave that city again. He is ceremoniously buried there upon his death. David's experience can be rephrased in terms employed by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. David is a conflict-induced involuntary migrant who flees because of a well-founded fear for his life. Legally, he qualifies for asylum and refugee status. David lives as an internally displaced person who self-settles in the first case. Eventually, his search for safety causes him to migrate externally and formally appeal for asylum. A foreign government grants David legal status as a refugee, then contingently settles him in one of its towns. The death of a political leader permits David to repatriate. This return migration results in a social ascent for David, who becomes king over Judah and Benjamin. After many years, political unrest within Judah once again makes David a conflict-induced, externally displaced, involuntary migrant who self-settles with fellow involuntary migrants in the borderland area of Israel, Aram, and Ammon. Military victory over his adversaries enables David to repatriate again. Twice an involuntary migrant, twice a return migrant, David never leaves his chosen home of Jerusalem again. Involuntary migration, then, unmistakably shapes the David narrative. The commentator, therefore, justifiably employs the social scientific study of involuntary migration to interpret the text and to analyze its characters. And yet this work remains notably absent in the secondary literature. So in this paper, I shall begin to address this lacuna using a hermeneutic of migration in order to interpret key episodes in the David narrative. Now, some of you will know the Hunter S. Thompson story, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, a savage journey to the heart of the American dream, an apropos novel when it was written in the 70s, and certainly, again, I fear, in American culture today. For those who do not know it, it follows the experiences of a journalist on 2 trips he makes to Las Vegas. And the story offers a strident critique of American culture, the unfulfilled promise of the 1960s, and the journalistic narration of American life. There are some illuminating aspects of Thompson's story for interpreting the David narrative. First, at the foundational level, the narratives share a structure based on 2 journeys. Second, there's ample evidence that the David narrative advances a vociferous critique of Judahite culture, the suitability of its political leaders, and the failure of Judahite culture to attain the promise held in its idealistic expressions of justice, fulfillment, and delight for all its members. Third, when read with a hermeneutic of migration, one can see that the David narrative seeks to unsettle its audience in a comparable fashion to Fear and Loathing, albeit in a very different context. So I'll use those 2 journeys to organize my explorations of 2 key features from each involuntary migration. David first appears under the pretense of obscurity and insignificance, but whatever aspect of that might characterize his early youth erodes immediately when Samuel, the most prominent religious figure in all of Judah and Benjamin, anoints him a future king. Without delay, David emerges as a military hero, son-in-law to the king, and close confidant of the logical heir to the throne. David accrues a set of relationships that provide him an international knowledge network and imbue him with substantial social capital. Soon enough, David's survival will require him to leverage every bit of these resources. Saul first displays hostility against David in 1 Samuel 19, where David's military renown arouses the king's animosity and incites Saul's call for attempts on David's life. Jonathan alerts David. After guiding his friend to safety, Jonathan employs his influence with his father Saul to fashion a truce. It is momentary. Saul's second attempt to murder David compels Michal to protect David and facilitate his escape from danger. Michal provides David precious intelligence, demonstrating how his deep knowledge network permits his survival. David plans a further rendezvous with Jonathan to obtain yet more information about Saul's intentions. And when David discovers that the relationship with Saul is irretrievable, he begins his involuntary migration. Within the study of migration, none of this appears accidental. Caution is necessary to avoid anachronism, but research shows that asylum seekers and refugees, like all manner of marginalized people, see their claims succeed far more often when a qualified, knowledgeable person advocates for them and supports them. Now, this tends to involve legal counsel or political officials or non-governmental agency support in the 21st century. In antiquity, influential people played similar roles, though they did not have a professional qualification or institutional affiliation per se. These people often possessed social status that allowed influence with a powerful person. David resembles these involuntary migrants. His knowledge network arouses well-founded fear, and his social capital enables him to migrate, albeit involuntarily. David acts decisively to evade the violence he faces, but he is only capable of doing so because of his access to these intangible resources. David's next move reinforces that point and opens up a second. David first travels to the sanctuary at Nob and encounters Ahimelech, the priest in charge there. None of this seems accidental. Ahimelech represents another associate with resources to help David. Food, a weapon for self-protection, and as the audience learns belatedly in 1 Samuel 21 verse 8, intelligence about the movements of Doeg, one of Saul's assassins. David's interaction with Ahimelech introduces the role of dishonesty in David's involuntary migration. Pamela Rice explains that there is a variation in details and emphasis, but the overall consensus is that David deceived Ahimelech at Nob. Others, like Keith Bodner, approach the situation somewhat differently, regarding Ahimelech as party to the deception. Here, Doeg, not Ahimelech, is duped. Bodner cleverly argues the narrator's choice to tell almost the entire story of David's interaction with Ahimelech in chapter 21, verses 1 to 7, before revealing Doeg's presence in verse 8, puts David and Ahimelech into a deceptive alliance, with David perpetuating a falsehood. In an important essay exploring how trust features in involuntary migrants' interactions, Barbara Harrell-Bond and Evtihia Wojtyra quote an involuntary migrant source remarking that, quote, "To be a refugee means to learn to lie." Stripped of nearly all other means to provide for themselves, frequently regarded as a threat to the host population around them, dishonesty affords involuntary migrants a tool through which to test the trustworthiness of others who might support them. Necessity, not deficient morality, drives such dishonesty. Indeed, Harrell-Bond and Wojtyra make this observation when commenting on the ways in which refugees engage with refugee camp officials who distribute material aid. And all of this underscores that David is an involuntary migrant just like them, seeking to acquire necessary provisions. It's hardly surprising David employs the same tactics after his next move takes him to Gath. David, the notorious slayer of Goliath from Gath, elicits fear from the Philistines there. Fear of migrants is neither new, novel, nor unpredictable. David's response, likewise, reflects a common strategy deployed in that situation. He embraces the anxiety and utilizes it to protect himself. David feigns madness, generating yet more fear among the Philistines that encourages them to let David leave peacefully and to proceed to safety in his cave hideout of Adullam. David, in sum, exhibits two features that are indicative of involuntary migrants across time and place. First, David survives because he possesses an elaborate knowledge network that provides essential information to facilitate his escape and to access necessary provisions. Second, on several occasions, David willingly deploys falsehoods to survive precarious situations, an ancient experience of involuntary migration, as much as it is a contemporary one. Now, for time, it's necessary to skip past David's repatriation to Judah, his enthronement over Judah at Hebron, his defeat of the Benjamites, and enthronement over Benjamin. David's conquest of Jebus is the next area of focus, for it is this achievement that radically transforms David into a sedentary character, antagonistic to migration. Upon his enthronement, David desires Michal's return, so he commands that Michal be taken forcibly from her new husband and brought to him at Hebron. This is nothing short of David making Michal a trafficked person. She's kidnapped, forcibly displaced, and made a de facto sex worker at David's unilateral choice. The episode foreshadows David's devotion to a settled life enclosed within the walls of his palace. Indeed, David's next act is to attack Jebus so that he can move from his temporary palace at Hebron to his new capital city. David conquers the city, brings the Ark of the Covenant there, and thus draws to a close his traumatic involuntary migration from Saul with a rapid, albeit predicted, ascent to the throne. The narrator continues in 2 Samuel 7. When the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had granted him safety from all the enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, "Here I am dwelling in a house of cedar, while the ark of the Lord abides in a tent." Nathan said to the king, "Go and do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." Now, commentators understandably focus on issues about royal building projects here and the end of David's military achievements and the promise of his dynasty. Nevertheless, those readings overlook the vital role of migration in David's aspiration. The construction of a permanent home for Yahweh symbolizes David's intense desire to immobilize his life. David can no longer abide Yahweh as a mobile, peripateic deity dwelling in a tent, migrating as a pillar of fire or a cloud of smoke, or traveling out to war in an ark. Rather, he desires a stationary, immovable sanctuary for Yahweh. Yahweh unsympathetically refuses David's offer, an attitude that is sometimes obscured by the promise of the royal line to follow. But the issue pervades the episode with Bathsheba and Uriah too. That David even observes Bathsheba from the roof of his palace results from David's failure to be outside Jerusalem on campaign with his army. The pivotal episode in David's life occurs precisely because the former involuntary migrant now refuses to be mobile. Uriah exemplifies the opposite mentality. Called back from battle, Uriah refuses to enter his home, bathe, and lie with Bathsheba as David desires. Instead, Uriah insists on sleeping outside the entrance of David's palace, justifying his decision by an appeal to the ark, Yahweh's mobile dwelling, and the migratory life of the army of Israel and Judah. Uriah, like Yahweh before him, rebuffs David's encouragement of the sedentary life in a way that implicitly but clearly censures David's rejection of migration. In short, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that David's refusal to migrate lies at the heart of his own downfall. A pattern of relational entropy spirals out from David's assault on Bathsheba and Uriah, encapsulated in the self-declared punishment mediated back to David by the prophet Nathan. All this culminates when Absalom, David's third-born son, the killer of Amnon, the presumed heir to the throne, leads a coup against his father. When news of Absalom's intention to overthrow David reaches the palace, one expects the narrative to slow down, for David to contemplate his options, and for this heroic warrior and powerful king, now entrenched in Jerusalem, to declare his intent to fight valiantly against this upstart, rebellious child. Instead, David meekly announces that he and his courtiers must flee. A sense of déjà vu characterized David, once again becoming an involuntary migrant. As he leaves, David stops and encounters Ittai the Gittite in 2 Samuel 15, verse 17. David is dismayed by his presence. He says to Ittai, "Why should you go too with us? Go back and stay with the new king, for you are a foreigner, and you are also an involuntary migrant, a golé, from your country. You came only yesterday. Should I make you wander about with us today, when I myself must go wherever I can? Go back and take your kinsmen with you in faithfulness." Ittai replied to the king, "As the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, there your servant will be, whether for death or for life." And David said to Ittai, "Then march by." And Ittai the Gittite and all his men and all the children who were with him marched by. Ittai provides an interpretive key to the whole. While David reluctantly, ashamedly leaves Jerusalem, Ittai the Gittite sees no shame in this choice. David does not want to flee again. Ittai represents a willing migrant. Ittai will go wherever David and Yahweh go. His involuntary migration and integration into the host Judahite culture prepares Ittai for the journey. David, who has by now been undone because of his refusal to leave his palace in Jerusalem, carries animosity towards migration, even embarrassment about it. Research indicates that Ittai resembles the majority of migrants. When people have migrated once, they are far more likely to do so again in the future. Indeed, they are far more disposed to see migration as a sensible and reasonable way to focus their actions than those who have not migrated before. To conclude then, throughout the David narrative, in 1 and 2 Samuel, one sees that David is depicted as an involuntary migrant by narrators that exhibits familiarity with the complex human experience of involuntary migration. During his first involuntary journey, David embodies the asylum seeker and refugee who utilizes information and social capital to escape harm, and a willingness to use falsehood in order to survive. In the events related to his second involuntary journey, David appears as a chastised figure for eschewing mobility, if in implicit but substantial ways. The overriding impression one takes from reading these texts, with the study of migration as a guide, therefore, is that the narrators want their audience to embrace an openness to migration among their leaders and in their own lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. And thank you all for your contributions. Now we turn to the panel discussion, and the first to speak, I think, should be Frederik. Poulsen, would you like to react to the other papers you have been hearing here today?
Yes, thank you very much, Einar, Thomassen. And I'm grateful to both of you, Kristin Joachimsen and Casey Strine, for your very interesting papers. I think you, Kristin, have showed in a beautiful way how complex the story about Ruth is, and how many aspects there are and risk involved. And to you, Casey, I think that you, in a beautiful way, have showed the benefit of taking modern terminology and approaching the ancient text, where you might see something that readers before you have not seen, because you come with new questions or with a more refined terminology. And you said, or you quoted those two scholars who said that to be a refugee means to learn to lie. I think that's a very important observation. And I would like to take this to the book of Ruth and to you, Kristin, because back in September, I taught the book of Ruth to 30 master students here in Copenhagen. And I really realized how open this story is to interpretation. I mean, Ruth is often considered to be the ideal non-Jew who converts into Judaism. And if you take the famous verses in chapter 1, she says to Naomi, her mother-in-law, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, even if even death parts me from you." And what we discussed in my class was, what is actually the tone of these words? Traditionally, we have understood them as a very sincere message of conversion. She wants to belong. But if we take the aspects from Casey Strine's paper about lying, could the tone be a little different here? That Ruth, in fact, has no opportunities to go back to her family in Moab. the only thing she can do is to follow her mother-in-law back to Bethlehem. So, in a way, Ruth, can we trust her? Is her statement sincere? And it connects, of course, to what you said about the foreign women, because foreign women in Old Testament can seldom be trusted. So, please.
Thank you very much, Frederik. This is very interesting, and I think exactly what you are pointing to now is this in-between situation of Ruth, because I totally agree that it can be some subversive talk here. On the other hand, she speaks eloquently Hebrew, so she's also speaking the language of Bethlehemite in a beautiful parallelism and everything. So I think it's a kind of doubleness of Ruth here, that yeah, she's pleasing and at the same time forced. So thank you.
Yeah.
Do you think this is a deliberate ambiguity in the text, or is it an unavoidable ambiguity that arises from the structure of the situation itself?
I don't know.
No. Would any of you, the rest, the two others, comment on this particular narrative that we have in the book of Ruth? Casey?
Thank you, Professor Thomassen and Frederik. I think it's a wonderful question to take that the possibility of dishonesty to these other texts and ask whether we read things differently. What's interesting to me about the story of Ruth, and what I have looked at in more detail before, are the stories in the book of Genesis about Sarai and then Rebecca, where they are taken into foreign lands by their husband and presented as the sister rather than the wife of the patriarch, because it is their availability as someone to be married that makes them very useful in the situation of trying to navigate as someone who's an involuntary migrant. That opens up access to powerful people, and ultimately they leave those experiences wealthier as a family because of that lie and because of this woman from a foreign country potentially being open to marriage. If we take that idea to Ruth, and this question of dishonesty, part of that is how honest is Ruth being with Naomi when she says this? How honest is Naomi being with Ruth when she says she'll take her with them? And as the book makes it clear, they seem to have what we would call good intentions, but they lie to Boaz as well. So there is quite a lot of deception there. What I think is so important is that, as you say, this gives us a new way of reading these stories, which might open up new ways of understanding some of their difficulties. But it also points out how much work those of us who have not had this experience personally have to do to read stories that are about this experience of involuntary migration, and learning from either people who have been through this situation or literature about it, about how differently you have to look at the world when you face some of these challenges. And so I think that I don't know for sure how we should read Ruth, whether she's honest or dishonest, but I very much like asking that question as we read these stories to help us think about what they mean, and as we said, what they might mean for us today as well.
Thank you. Frederik, you have a further comment?
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that, Casey, because today we have discussed mostly migration in the Bible, but you have actually tried to do the other way around, to study the Bible among migrants. And could you say a little about that work and what it has given to you? What have you done?
Thank you. Yes, I've always very happy to talk about that work. This was a project that I led with an artist and art therapist here in Sheffield several years ago now. And we worked with a group of 6 people who were all here from different backgrounds seeking asylum in the United Kingdom. And we wanted to read with them these stories, some from Genesis, some from, we looked at a text from the book of Jeremiah about migration and those sorts of things, and to ask them the question as people who have lived through that experience, what questions do they have of the text? How do they understand the story? It's because it was very clear to me as someone who is a migrant living in the United Kingdom, but here very, very much by choice, that they had a different experience than I did that was much closer to these stories. And we had some wonderful discussions about how that went. And they made the pieces of art, as you saw, as a way of helping to reflect on those stories and to help facilitate our discussion with one another about it. What I found in many ways is the observation that I was just sharing at the end of talking about the book of Ruth, which is that I had, I think, far more to learn from them because of their experience about the ways in which a story could be read and could be understood than I had on my own. I mean, I brought knowledge as an ancient historian and as a biblical scholar, but they brought a perspective that was really important, and that it helped me see how hard I needed to work to understand stories, whether it be Ruth or Jonah or the book of Isaiah or David or the book of Ezekiel, whatever it is. They're so different from what I'm used to experiencing when it comes to migration. And that when you look at them that way, they open up with the sorts of things that they're trying to communicate to their audience. So for me, it was a very powerful lesson in the idea of who has knowledge that is relevant to the work that we're trying to do. And it opened up for me or reminded me that that the harder I work to learn from those perspectives, the more that I can see as I read these texts and look at the different aspects of ancient history.
Thank you for these interesting and illuminating comments on the book of Ruth. I think now I would like to ask Kristin Joachimsen if she would like to comment from her perspective on the papers by the 2 other panel presenters.
Yes, thank you to both of you. I think, as you said, Frederik, this shows the richness of perspectives on this topic. And it's interesting that when we got this invitation, no one chose to write or talk about Exodus or the Babylonian exile. We didn't focus especially on historical perspectives, none of us. So we really shows the richness of the topic. Frederik, what I especially appreciated with your paper was you also managed to show the complexity. And for instance, when it comes to Cain, this in between, for instance, you talked about the mark of survival, both that he's not forgotten by God, but also that he's isolated. So this complexity of the topic I found very interesting. Also, Tracy, the same as Frederik said, I found it very interesting to see how you use this UN definition of refugees to find so many nuances in the stories. So this really shows how it's useful to use also modern models, but with care, of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Casey, would you like to comment on some issues that have not been touched on so far?
Yes, thank you. I want to say as well that I found both papers very helpful in the different perspectives. Kristin, your discussion of Ruth, I thought brought out lots of important points that we can overlook if we read too quickly. And I thought your discussion of what it means for Ruth to be foreign but attempt to integrate into a new community was really helpful for me, and really challenges us to think about that character and to think about how what that experience must have been like to read a short book that you can read very quickly, but to think about it very slowly and to take those on. It's also very interesting, of course. I didn't mention this, but because Ruth is positioned in at least the Christian ordering of the books as the prelude to the story of David, and as an ancestor of David, I think there's a really helpful way that even enriches the story of David as an involuntary migrant, to see that as part of his history, his ancestry. Frederik, your paper was fascinating in the way that you brought these two characters of Cain and Jonah together. And I thought your analysis of both was really helpful. I wanted to ask, if I could, to you about Jonah, because Jonah is interesting. You've worked a lot on Isaiah, and on the sort of the latter parts of Isaiah, which speak to the Babylonian exile, whether they're from the Babylonian exile or not. And so many of our other prophets speak from or in that experience. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel is set in that position as well. But Jonah is set very much in the land of Israel and Judah, and only has to leave because Yahweh, sends him to the Assyrians rather than because of exile. But so could you say how Jonah, making Jonah into a forced migrant, makes Jonah more like our other prophets, or does it make Jonah different, that we should see Jonah more in continuity with other texts, or should we see Jonah as something that really stands entirely apart from the other prophets that we would think of, and what they're saying about involuntary migration?
Well, thank you very much, Casey. A good question. Of course, there are some themes in the book of Jonah, which links it to the other prophets, Isaiah, the last part of Isaiah, because of the question of is God only God for Israel or for all nations? But something that people often say is that in the book of Jonah, we lack a call narrative. I mean, in the other prophetic books, we have a clear call narrative. The prophet is called, but he refuses to do so, and then something happens. And in a way, the first chapters of Jonah is a kind of call narrative, where he refuses or rejects the task, and then experience something profoundly that makes him able to enter into or to accept the commission. And I would say Jeremiah, at least according to tradition, is a migrant. I mean, he flees or is forced to leave to Egypt, and Ezekiel as well. In the narrative of he takes his bag and he leaves Jerusalem and so on. So perhaps there is a pattern that I mean, the true prophet must be some in between figure. That's the role of a prophet, right? To be the mediator. So the prophet can't be just like us. He must be somehow different. But I'll consider that further. The idea of the prophet as a migrant. as one. I mean, in a word, he brings the word to the people, and here he does it in a very literal way because he needs to travel far to bring the message. So yes, there must be some kind of connection. So thank you.
Thank you all. There is one question that I would like to ask all of you that has occurred to me when I've been listening to your papers. That is that you are all speaking very much about texts and what is going on in the texts. And I'm also interested in the socio-cultural circumstances in which these people are living, because I mean, you have a society where some people are nomads and are attached to clans, other people are sedentary populations, live in villages and so on, and it strikes me that the attitudes to wandering and migration would appear differently for these different kinds of populations. So I would like to ask you, to what extent are these socio-economic backgrounds visible in the texts, and are there some general lessons about migration and the hospitality to strangers and all these aspects that can be looked at from that point of perspective? What do you say?
Nothing.
I'm sorry if I have brought you all to silence, but is this at all an interesting type of question?
It certainly is, and I think if you go back to the four approaches that I sketched in the opening of my paper, I think your question would belong to the first or the second one, a historical approach. What can we know about migration in the ancient world, and also the sociological approach about social dynamics and patterns. I think my own view is that, of course, the literature in the Old Testament is shaped by history and by real experiences by humans, but it's also literature, and often I think that the text really plays with reality, and the author creates a story that, of course, to some extent reflects social realities, but it's also literature. But one point I considered when I heard both the papers by Kristin and Casey is the importance of network and knowledge for migrants. I think we find that reflected in the text in a very clear way. I mean, Casey, you spoke about the importance of David's network in order for him to move around and to receive support and asylum. And in the book of Ruth, you see the issue of network in a very clear way as well, because everything is set within the family, and within the family is religion. And I think if you go to modern studies about how migrants connect and get involved in the country to which they travel or migrate, then it's certainly through these different networks which have to do with family and religion. So perhaps we have here some kind of common features between our time and the ancient past. That the importance of network is certainly one of them.
Anybody else? Casey?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a really fascinating point for us to reflect on, Professor Thomassen. And Frederik, I'm glad you brought up your 4 points, your 4 ways or approaches. You know, it's interesting that I've spoken about this story around King David and King Saul as a piece of literature. I've compared it to a fictional novel. But you know, there are, I think, some historical pieces of evidence in the story about David that we can consider. It's not a straightforward historical narrative, but it does, I think, give us some history about actual figures of maybe the 9th and 10th century. Now, the story is probably written much later. I revised that the legend you mentioned, Professor Thomassen, the story of Rome's founding, it written much later and projected back. So I think this has some history in it, but is written later and projected back. But it's written by people who are probably either living directly under the threat of being forcibly displaced by a foreign army, or people who have already been forcibly displaced by the Babylonian army to Babylon somewhere. And they're presenting a king who probably was, whether we choose the word nomadic or somewhat of a migrant, and then had to be an involuntary migrant, and is presented that way in order to speak to their later historical experience. So we have this confusing thing with the biblical narrative that we always do, which is it may be telling us something actually historical about a person called David who was a migrant, and it's a later reflection on that story by other people who were involuntary migrants, framing that character in that way, and then it's written to later generations who also experience involuntary migration. So historically speaking, we could look at archaeological evidence. We could look at evidence outside the Hebrew Bible that confirms that almost all of these stories come from populations who are experiencing that and who are then reflecting on that experience in the way they told these stories to later generations. So I do think their lives, their actual experience of involuntary migration is really important to the stories they choose to preserve and the ways that they choose to preserve those stories. Much like migrants today, the stories they choose to preserve from their own experiences and the way they choose to preserve them is definitely shaped by that experience.
Thank you. We are coming, I'm afraid, towards the end of the seminar. We have a limited time available, and I also should allow some minutes for you to respond to the question and answers that have been coming in. And in fact, there is one question, and I'm going to read it to you to see what you have to say. From Eivind Algrøy, who asks, I was surprised to see the lack of references to the many sayings attributed to Yahweh in the Old Testament about the protection of refugees and foreigners in your outlines. What part can these statements play in the moral debate about refugees today? A large question that can be answered in various ways, but what do you have to say, Kristin?
I think one explanation of how Ruth is taken care of in Bethlehem is this tradition of taking care of widows, sojourners, and so on. So it was part of the Ruth analysis, I would say, this aspect.
So there you have one example of how foreigners should be, a model example of how foreigners should be treated. And Frederik? Yes?
Yes, certainly. Well, one of the key statements in Deuteronomy is that you should, you should love the foreigner or take care of the foreigner because God took care of you when you were in Egypt. So it's a kind of mirror. And I think if you go to Christianity, there is an idea partly shaped by the biblical stories that in a way we are all travelers. If you take the Adam and Eve story in Genesis 2:3, one possible way of interpreting that story is that banishment from the place they were created to be is really part of human identity. So as human, we are travelers, and we have always been travelers. So that could be a thing to remember if you enter into the role of the host, that in a way you yourself is a guest or a traveler in the world. So you should take care of those who come to you.
Casey, you agree with this?
Yeah, I think Frederik has said it very well, that you know, from a scholarly standpoint, we recognize that there are two sides of this discussion about being a migrant and a refugee, and the Hebrew Bible tells lots of stories from that perspective, but it also speaks from the perspective of being the host. And when it does, it encourages you to have empathy with people who have been migrants, whether you've had that experience yourself or not. And it expresses a deep conviction that we need to care for those people who are in a marginalized situation. So I think Frederik has said it very well.
Yes, so do I. I think it's both a question of showing hospitality as a moral virtue, and also of guaranteeing foreigners the same legal rights as the indigenous population. So these are important issues that you can find reflections on even in the Hebrew Bible. Well, then our time is up. It only remains for me to thank you all very much for your presentations, and for your lively engagement in the discussion and the important questions that you have raised. So thank you all very much.